There we go. Hello. Hello, everybody. So, look, I'll even say hello on screen. Good. Well, so thank you for those of you joining me live on the Zoom. And if you're joining me on Facebook or YouTube, a big hello as well. Please let me know who you are. You can always type it in the comments, do those kinds of things. So we're continuing through the Sermon on the Mount this week. So I've called this the Sermon on the Mount Part 2. That's not very original. And then I thought, let's give it a title, and I've called it A Salt and Light. And just to prove what a fantastically good joke that is, I'll now have to explain the logic of it. Because we're going to cover the phrase which a lot of us will be aware of, that you are salt and light. But the thing I really wanted to get across is, you see, the whole of this section is really framed by the last verse that we looked at last week. So as we kind of finished, remember we saw how the Sermon on the Mount, how it kind of it opens up with these 8 beatitudes, the 8 blessings, which maybe are reflective of the fact that there's an 8-fold blessing that is promised for keeping the law in the book of Deuteronomy. And the final of those is, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then immediately Jesus takes those messages that he said and starts to turn it around and push it into those who are now being discipled, because they're not just learners, they are disciples. They're looking to grow in their human and emotional and spiritual selves. Not just kind of add to their background and knowledge base. So he kind of immediately then turns it on with, so therefore you're blessed when people insult and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil things against you because of me. And so I really want to draw this out, that this whole of this phrase, this passage that we're going to look at about being salt and light, really is framed by the idea of a little bit of persecution and a coming against. And actually, we're going to see it may slightly change our understanding of what Jesus was saying, because this passage is so familiar, but we've so often stripped that idea of being salt and light out from the idea and context of persecution. So anyway, coming back to the verses, so you're blessed when people insult you and they persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Be cheerful and celebrate, because your great heavenly because of your great heavenly reward. After all, this is how they persecuted the prophets before you. So remember, as we were saying last week, what Jesus is doing is he kind of reframes the sorts of experiences that he expects those who are disciples to be going through, and persecution is the first one we're going to unpack. But actually, there is something about following him that's not just about knowledge. It is actually about discovering and becoming realistic about our poverty of spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit. It's about those who are in discipleship. There is something about that is discovering meekness. And as we were thinking last week, it's meekness. A war horse is meek because its strength is in service of a bigger agenda, and it serves other people. So meekness is not about being weak; it's about serving with your strength. So it puts it in that place. Something about discipleship is going to have to get hold of that. And so he kicks off the whole thing with, in one sense, what perhaps is one of the hardest things to cope with, which is part of discipleship is going to involve persecution. And he wants us to try and understand and reframe our way of thinking and seeing that persecution. So you're blessed when you're persecuted, and you're blessed when people insult you and persecute you, falsely say all kinds on account of me. Be cheerful and celebrate. And I think we often the way we've translated scripture is often so bland. And the way we hear it so often, we don't hear it as normal dialogue. So I've tried to make it feel a bit more normal in the dialogue of verse 12, but by keeping a kind of a one-to-one equivalence with the Greek words. But be cheerful and celebrate for your great heavenly reward. After all, this is how they persecuted the prophets before you. That actually, if we look back, we see people that in many ways, the Jews of Jesus' day, they all admired the prophets and all wished they could be one. It's a bit like when you watch a kind of really exciting film, and you like to imagine yourself as Batman. But what you don't like is all the punching that goes on. We love to imagine to be those characters, but actually what they had to do to be the kind of character that I want to be is often go through something we didn't want to go through ourselves. And so Jesus kind of redirects their thinking to saying the kind of people you're going to be may well encounter opposition. There's a reason why you admire them. There's a reason why you want to be like them, but it's not trivial. It's not trivial, and they themselves suffered. And so Jesus then he adds that he brings in this little phrase, you're the salt of the earth. But if the salt's become tasteless, what will it be salted? It's good for nothing except to be thrown out and trampled upon by men. And that little phrase there, I'm looking at my screen here, it says become tasteless. The actual Greek is it's become foolish. And our translators make it tasteless. But there's a fascinating little truth in here, which kind of really drives back to the originality of Matthew's text. Remember, the early church fathers told us that originally Matthew was written in Hebrew, which people think could be Hebrew, could be Aramaic. But the truth is, in Hebrew or Aramaic, there's the word that means tasteless also means to be foolish. It's a dual play on words. And those who understand that, there's been a little bit of debate around this verse. It says, "You are the salt of the earth," but if the salt has become foolish, or is useless, is something that doesn't quite work with it, is that the same as tasteless? And as they debate it, and we'll think about the kind of the way in which the meanings stretch, I suspect that the reason why, when Matthew has been translated into Greek, or perhaps even written in Greek by Matthew, who's already done it in Hebrew, he's chosen the word foolish rather than the Greek word for tasteless, but perhaps reflecting the duality is because he wants to bring the duality into the Greek. So you're the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless or useless, or foolish. Sorry, let's keep it with foolish. If it's become foolish, now why do I say that? And because there's a lot of debate, which a lot of you will hear, because pure salt doesn't ever lose its saltiness, and that's fine, because actually it's likely that the salt. Pardon me, just grab a drink. It's likely that the salt that Jesus is talking about is not 100% pure. There are salt mines around the Dead Sea, for instance, and you can also distill salt out of the Dead Sea. Certainly that in the mines around, you're getting all sorts of earth in it. And it's interesting, you are the salt of the earth. And so there's almost a duality here. You're kind of like dirty salt, you're earthy salt. You're salt that's kind of mixed because it's been dug up out of the earth. But equally, sometimes that salt is used for fertilizing, you see, because it's got all sorts of minerals in it. So the salts that have been kind of dug out have got all sorts of minerals in. You fertilize the ground with them, and so there's a huge amount of, if you like, imaginative context to the words that Jesus is saying, which we kind of have reduced in lots of ways, because there are connections, and when we hear engaging language in the modern sense, it's engaging because it makes us think of all sorts of possibilities. It's really boring if it's too precise. In fact, the most precise language, of course, is a computer code, and if someone read you computer code, you would be turning off and disengaging very quickly. Its poetic language is engaging because it makes us think of multiple possibilities, and I often think this is something we don't want to miss when we understand how Jesus communicates. He communicated in a way that allowed people's imaginations to paint 5 different pictures, and all of them have an aspect to play in this. So you're the salt of the earth, well, because you're perhaps been dug up out of the earth. That's how we got most of our salt in Jerusalem, probably at the time. But you're also salt of the earth when it's in its really dirty form. You might sow it straight into the ground as fertilizer, which makes the ground more productive. So that's a really important function. But if the salt has become foolishness or tasteless, as Jesus is speaking in Aramaic when he says it, if it's become one of those two things, well, what's it going to be salted with? How are you going to make it salty again? And the kind of the concept here is it's good for nothing except throwing out to be trampled on by men. You see, if it is that kind of dirty sort of salt, and actually you really do lose its saltiness, you may not even want to think of using it for fertilizer. But actually, there is still something you might do with it, which is that people threw stuff onto the well-worn tracks. Just to make the ground a little bit more solid. As you all know, if you walk in the countryside, where people walk tends to be where puddles collect and gets very muddy. And so actually, right from the ancient world, all sorts of stuff has been thrown along the streets deliberately to be walked into it. We might throw straw down, we might throw bits of grit, we might throw salt down on a slippery road, of course. So there is a kind of a final use for the sort of salt you might have. Even if you can't eat it because it's not that good a quality. You can't sow it as fertilizer, but you can at least throw it in the street and it does something useful. But actually, if you're being trampled on, well, that's a Jewish metaphor for being persecuted and being beaten up. If you think about it, and I put the connections there. Luke 8 is about seed that falls on the path, and it ends up getting trampled on. It just becomes part of the kind of the ballast that makes the path a little bit stronger. Then the Luke 21 verse is about the destruction of Jerusalem, which is the Jerusalem being trampled on by the Gentiles, which is they've been persecuted. And so you've got all of these kind of ideas are being kind of wrapped together. There's something of, what, we're getting persecuted. Well, the final use for salt, if you've lost some of your saltiness, is that's what happens to you. If your righteousness is seen as foolishness by the world, don't be surprised if the only thing they can do with you is throw you on the path and walk on you. It's the kind of the idea. And there's more that kind of goes on in this, because one of the things which we've lost the context, which you find as you go back and you look at the rabbinic writings, is that the idea of the salt of the earth actually ties into the concept of the Torah, or the law of Moses, which of course has been part of the context up to this point. As Jesus has kind of presented the Sermon on the Mount from this point of view of 8 blessings, which kind of is reflecting perhaps what the anticipation or hope was if they ever kept the law fully. But actually, the idea of the law was often, or we think of, when I say often, I can't say how often, but you find referred to in the Talmuds as being the law itself. And part of that is you'll find that the concept of salt is often used in context of covenant. So there's the salt of the covenant and so on. And so the rabbis start to kind of talk about the words and the precepts of the law as being like salt. And every offering is supposed to be offered with salt. And so there's something of that kind of context coming in here. There's something about how the words of God have got into us and been salt in us. But Jesus pushes the metaphor a little bit. He doesn't kind of say the words themselves were the salt. He says, you're the salt. So there is a message from God, which is the salt, which is the salt, which the rabbis kind of interpret metaphorically as being that when we give our offerings and we do everything, we need to be fully have let those words seep into us like salt does. So they are the salt for us. But now we, because we've absorbed that salt, have become like salt to the earth. So for everything else, so just as we are being transformed by taking on the salt of what God has spoken through the law into our hearts, now we act as salt to the earth, and that kind of salt therefore is a bit mixed. It's perhaps why it is like salt of the earth. It's gritty salt with all sorts of other things in it, which is how come salt can become tasteless in that context. And so if I give you a example which I put in here, here's a from the Talmud. So they actually record, this is a 1st century example. It's after Jesus, and that's interesting because there may be something of what Jesus' teaching is reflected in this. It's because we know it's after Jesus because it's post the temple destruction. And it's in a passage, the Bekarot 8b, which describes a debate between a rabbi. It's probably not a real debate. It's kind of more of an illustrative to try and show how much brighter the Jewish rabbis were than the Greek philosophers. So it presents a kind of debate between a smart rabbi, Rabbi Yehoshua, and 60 Greek philosophers. And it has also, and each time Rabbi Yehoshua kind of wins with a clever little statement, as you kind of go. and just so you know, I'm not making these things up. I've actually put the text from the Talmud in Hebrew. The white characters you're looking at there on your screen, if you can see them in the red, are English punctuations, but it just kind of helps you see where you can follow it. Then you can sort of see how it roughly breaks up. So here it says, so they asked him, when salt gets spoiled, what do we use to preserve it? So similar concept. Salt losing its saltiness, what do we do to get its saltiness back? See, a similar kind of concept. And Rabbi Yehoshua's response is, we use the placenta of a mule, or the afterbirth of a mule. And they asked the question, because you see, just to remind you in case you didn't know, or remind you if you've forgotten, I should say, mules, of course, don't have children. They don't have babies. They're the hybrid of a horse and a donkey, and they can't reproduce themselves, you see. So the Greeks kind of say, but do mules have a placenta? As if you must be stupid if you think mules have got a placenta. And to show how clever he is, Rabbi Yehoshua says, does salt spoil? He retorted. And you got this similar kind of thing, that pure salt, of course, doesn't spoil. But sometimes we talk about it spoiling because of the way it gets into us. And in that context, this whole debate is understood as being a discussion as to whether, if you like, the Jewish law was still relevant in the modern world, you see. And so you've got your thing that you refer to as salt, and he's saying it's the law, it's pure salt, and so it doesn't spoil. And therefore it's kind of almost irrelevant to ask the question, how could it go off? It's just how it's got into us. But there's perhaps even a hint here at the way in which Jesus' message has come to us through the Gospels, which is to kind of almost challenge him, because salt doesn't really spoil. But actually Jesus, we don't need to kind of see that as him having the final word or anything. It's just kind of seeing the way in which part of this kind of debate seems to have gone forwards. And so perhaps even because the Talmuds at this point do make sometimes derogatory references to a false rabbi whose name is Yeshu, and it almost certainly is Jesus, because he has similar named disciples to Jesus, but all with slightly corrupt names. So it's quite possible that this little phrase within the Talmuds is actually kind of in reference to this idea, because Jesus talks about when salt has lost its saltiness, if that makes sense. So that was a very long and convoluted way of trying to describe something that, when you really draw it down, I think in its context was saying, so you got the idea of pure salt here in the law, which Jesus is going to refer to in a second. And as you absorb it, you then become salt to the rest of the earth. But you're perhaps a bit like that mixed salt, which can lose its saltiness. Its saltiness can kind of go. But when that happens, and if you lose your flavour, your salty flavour, or if you're judged as being foolish by the world around you, don't be surprised if they end up throwing you on the street, because that's what we do with salt like that, and we walk it in just as ballast onto the ground. At least it's doing something useful. As it gets trampled, it's making a way for people to actually travel on. And so there's a kind of a challenge in a sense that actually even our persecution is producing something useful. But it's even when it's become foolishness. But we mustn't miss either the context of, if we have lost our saltiness, we'll be trampled on. Because actually, of course, that is what happens. The Jewish people have received the scriptures, the pure salt. They themselves have absorbed those, but they've become foolish and tasteless. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. And as we saw in Luke 21, that same phrase about being trampled on is, of course, what happened to Jerusalem. And so there's probably a prophetic sense in what Jesus is presenting. And I like to see it that way, because that also then adds something else, which is modern thinking tends to think that Matthew is written after, all of the Gospels are written after the destruction of the temple. Now, if it was written after the temple, almost certainly I think there would be something in this passage which kind of made reference and made that obvious to us. The fact it's not obvious even though there is a very real connection that can be made between the trampling underfoot that happens to Jerusalem, because the Jewish nation, even though they had pure soldiers, they have internalized it, have become foolishness and lost their flavour. You would have it much more kind of obviously woven in. The fact it's so obtuse that, it takes a lot of thinking about and reflection over years, and people spotting things and going, I wonder if, it shows you much more of a sense in which Matthew's accidentally recorded something which that actually has a real kind of fulfillment element to it. So anyway, let's keep going So then Jesus turns the metaphor around, but again, we mustn't lose the persecution context, which is all framed in here. You're the light of the world. A city set on a hill can't be hidden. So when Jesus is a child and they leave Egypt and go back to after Archelaus has taken over from Herod the Great, they move up to Nazareth. His father is a builder. In about 3 BC, about the time they were moving back, the largest kind of building project in the ancient world, or about the third largest building project in the ancient world in Jesus' lifetime, starts 4 miles up the road from Nazareth. What actually happened is that Herod Antipas, who'd inherited the kingdom of Galilee, rebuilt the city of Zipporah and became Sepphoris, and it became the Jewish capital of the whole region. So it went from being a ruined city and all being rebuilt up, which meant that Jesus' father had ample work, and probably Jesus worked on it. They had a theatre in there, it's all sorts of things. So Jesus would have learnt the word theatre, which he refers to. If you're play actors, you're hypocrites. That word, you see, is part of the culture. But here's the thing, it kind of gives us context again. It is actually, Sepphoris is right at the top of the hill, looking down towards Galilee, towards the Sea of Galilee. So it is a city set on a hill that can't be hidden. If you're the other side even of the lake, it's possible to make out the lights of the city up there on the top of the hill, because it's such a big, significant city. You can probably, even when you're miles away, make it out. But equally, that city that was set on that hill that you can't hide, that's people's experience in their day, had been destroyed just before Jesus was born, because it had become a symbol of rebellion by the Jews, and so it had attracted some persecution. So there's a kind of a useful thing in that it can't be hidden, because it helps people know where they are. If you're out in the dark and you can see the lights of the city from miles away, you've got a rough idea of where your position is, and that's a useful function. But equally, its prominence also is the thing that's drawn people to it in a way that actually has not been good for it. It has been persecuted. It has been trampled underfoot. So anyway, it's kind of, again, very similar way. You kind of got all sorts of sort of cultural plays going on as Jesus is using this example. So nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket. Rather, they set it on a lampstand, and it gives light to everyone. So even if that is the case, even if being on the hill meant that it's attracted attack, even though it's actually a useful thing, and we don't want to hide it, you need to have it out there. And we won't do this now, because I'm taking, I try and keep these quite tight and quite focused at lunchtime. But I have a course starting in a couple of weeks where we're looking at this Sermon on the Mount in more depth from the sort of psychology of it. But it is just interesting that it's now understood that the most attractive characteristic in those people who we think of as natural leaders is moral integrity. So I can't unpack that because we haven't got the time here. We'll do that if you make any of the evening sessions. So moral integrity is the most. It used to be thought that warmth was the most attractive, but now it's understood it's probably moral. It looks like it's moral integrity. And in fact, moral integrity is so appreciated by people that makes them naturally draw to your sense of leadership or position. It's so attractive that we all fake it, which is why you get the huge cultural phenomena of virtue signalling and moral hypocrisy. And moral hypocrisy is so prevalent because we are deeply wired to be deeply attracted and drawn to and follow real moral integrity. So we therefore we become moral hypocrites because we want to present and project moral integrity or morality, but we don't want to do it. And the flip side of that is unfortunately sometimes you're all in the mix and in the play, but actually the person with real integrity, the person and I say this without any kind of joy, it has been discovered that you need to have something like a religious motivation to really maintain moral integrity. You need to have some convictional thing. But that a lot of people who express moral convictional things don't actually live to it in private in the way they do in public. So unfortunately, there's an awful lot of folks, and that is part of just the truth. The church is full, just as society is full of people who live with a certain level of moral hypocrisy. The persecution comes in is that very often it's when the rubber hits the road and you don't do what you're supposed to do. And I won't name names in this, but I can talk of a couple of pastoral situations, even in the last couple of weeks, where an individual has actually been able, and it's quite nice, quite nice when this happens, but in a cultural kind of context or work context where people have wanted them to lie on their behalf, and they've been able to say, but I don't. And actually, in that context, it's allowed them to navigate with certain people. That they're not going to cover something up, but that's not personal against this person. It's actually just the truth of their moral integrity. But flip side on the other side is there are those who want them to do that and don't get it. Why don't you just play the game when it comes along? And so actually it's quite a tough thing to do. To really maintain the truth of it right the way through. So it's not just something you're signalling, but it's actually something you live by. It does put you into places of conflict. So it's a very real statement by Jesus. So let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and give glory to the Father who is in heaven. You've got this in good duality that actually sometimes people recognize it. In actual fact, it's a really key kind of part of our witness when we can speak like that. To say, actually, I'm not going to lie, but that's not personal against you. It's just that's me, isn't it? That's how I do it. You know that. You know the truth of that. That's probably why you liked me in the first place. It's because I'm honest with you. And then we get this interesting little phrase. Don't think I've come to abolish the law of the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to complete them. Okay. So I've not come to abolish them, but I've something about me is fulfilling them. And as we saw in Deuteronomy, there is a kind of a transition in fulfillment. If you've completed this law, then there are these blessings. We're now moving into a place where, yes, they haven't disappeared, but their position in who we are is being shifted because they've been completed. And you kind of get a final sort of sense of that, because otherwise you get this strange thing where it seems like Paul does exactly what Jesus says not to do here. For I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not a single jot or a pen stroke shall pass away from the law, until all things are accomplished. So it's all going to be accomplished. So whoever, and that little word until there at the end of that verse, it's kind of got an interesting kind of doubling up. There's a word that we never translate from the Greek into English, but it just kind of qualifies it a little bit. And I'm not sure if you could say precisely there for it's until or unless, but I think the reason why we've gone for until rather than till is that it's this kind of concept. Until heaven and earth pass away, not a single pen stroke shall pass away from the law. Until all things are accomplished, it's kind of like there's a contingency on it, and so there is a way of understanding it. Say, well, Jesus did accomplish things, so perhaps things have loosened up a bit. And that's probably the best way of understanding it. They have loosened up, but they've not gone totally. But they may have loosened up because he's pushed us out from the place of commandment to law. And just something useful to notice here is that whoever breaks one of the commandments, Jesus uses the phrase commandments. The Old Testament doesn't. We think about the 10 commandments in the Old Testament. The actual Hebrew there is the 10 words, the 10 statements. I won't unpack them here, but but actually the commandments, probably when Jesus uses it, are tying it down to the 10, the kind of the summary statements, rather than all of the detail, little statements, i.e. not lying, not murdering or taking a life, not bearing false witness. So actually these broad things which we sum up with the idea of commandments But actually the Old Testament refers to as statements, as instruction and direction and so on, as they're summed up. If you're teaching others to do the same, you'll be called least in the kingdom of the heavens. I've gone for heavens plural because that's the way Matthew says it, which again reflects the fact it was probably originally written in Hebrew. You'll be called least in the kingdom. So notice that actually, if you are teaching others not to do these things, it doesn't mean that you're not in the kingdom, but you're not going to be significant in the kingdom. You hear it that way? So it's not saying you've lost your salvation. And there are an awful lot of Christians who live in all sorts of ways. But there is something about the commandments side that we've taken the words and we've kind of tried to solidify them. And they become this direction that if you're teaching others that, okay, but lying, it's okay, really. Nobody really gets hurt if you just say it like this. And you're doing it for others. Actually, somehow it's diminishing our position in the kingdom of God. As Jesus is going to pick up in later on in Matthew in the missions sermon, and then in the sermon about the kingdom of God, he's going to look at actually the effectiveness we have in that kingdom. Actually, you will somehow lose your effectiveness if you start to break those things. But whoever keeps and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. It's not that you do those things and that's what makes you great, but actually it's those who are like that who actually are going to see the things of the kingdom happen most around them. So don't assume that you can just forget about them and live any old way. There may be a shift coming, but that's only part of the story. And then just the final verse. So I tell you that unless your righteousness significantly exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees. I've gone for significantly exceeds because there are actually two words used in the Greek there. It is unless you surpass above. So you're not just surpassing them, but you're surpassing and above. So you're significantly exceeding that of the scribes and the Pharisees. You'll not enter into the kingdom of the heavens. And again, we can kind of talk a little bit around. This is not a huge amount I necessarily want to say, but I think that kind of doubling up of the words shows it's approaching it a very different way. It's not just exceeding it, but it's exceeding it above. It's approaching these rules in a way that is not that they are the end in themselves, but they are the means into something, which is the kingdom of God. And so if you're wanting to get into this place, the kingdom of the heavens, you've got to keep these things, but you've got to keep them in a way that not only is kind of more than the scribes do it and the Pharisees do it. So you can find writings in the Talmuds and so on, debates by the scribes and the Pharisees of who you can have an affair with, who you can commit adultery with, and it doesn't really count. So you can see you can be exceeding it, but not only are you exceeding it, but you're exceeding it above. You're significantly exceeding it. You're doing it in a different way, because actually that's the way you enter the kingdom. And if you're not doing it that way, you can argue about the details and you can come up with all the exception clauses you like that say it was legitimate here rather than there. But that way of doing it is not the way in which you're actually pressing into the benefits and blessings of kingdom life. So that's the text for today. I'm looking at, we've gone a couple of minutes over the half hour. But would anyone like to ask any questions or make any statements or throw anything in at this stage before we? No. Well, I've thrown. Well, I always hope. My prayer is always to throw something out that makes you think. And my hope and prayer is that there's some thoughts in there that make you think. Part of the fun of doing them, from my point of view, is it makes me think about things fresh every time I try and do one of these. So I kind of enjoy that process. And as you'll pick up as we kind of go through, for me that is actually part of the way in which good teaching works. It's not that you just log it in your brain, but that actually it gets you engaged in a way that actually transforms and changes you. So I enjoy the preparation and the delivery side. Because it makes me stop and think about these things again. And my hope is there are things today that usefully make you think. Or I don't know if anyone wants to comment on those for the record before we finish.
No, if you're anything like me, Christian, you prepare than you intend to deliver just in case.
Yeah. yeah. No, I know what you. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. No.
Interested in the trampling underfoot, Kristen, and the usefulness of that, really. I'm not sure how that fits in with our experience of being persecuted.
Yeah. So I think that I'm thinking that it's not that this is exactly what it means, because as I say, good orators often paint pictures that can mean slightly different things to a wider audience, and that's really I think is what Jesus has done. But I think that there is a thread in which the use of the Aramaic word he probably used, which means both foolishness and flavourless, probably means that some people look at it and go, useless. So we don't care about your righteousness. But if we don't care about it, it's not good for preserving anything. It's not good for flavouring anything. So we'll just, what it is good for is we can throw it on the path for people to walk on. Now that's not, now if you are the salt of the earth, that doesn't feel great because you're getting walked all over. But there's a kind of I think a slightly kind of humorous picture that Jesus has painted, that even that's kind of got a bit of use to it. But that's what happens if you've lost, if as you've been salted with pure salt, the word of God, if in you it's produced that kind of more like salt of the earth, the dug up sort of gritty with all sorts of other stuff in there, and that's not really that salty anymore, well then the only things you got with that grit is for ballast, but at least you're doing something useful there.
So, Kristen, there's a phrase in the Old Testament, there's a highway there, walk in it.
Yeah.
And I think before that it says, come out, and avoid, the world. So that salt being thrown down, is it making a highway?
It's making a highway, exactly right. Yeah, no, and as I say, I wouldn't want to say that's exactly what Jesus meant, but what I was trying to say is there's a host of those things that people would draw from it, and as they meditate on it and understand it, that even if I feel like I'm being walked on, maybe I'm creating a path for somebody else. And I can think of 1,001 different evangelist stories I've heard over the years of how they became, well, they came into ministry, but actually often by trampling on somebody first of all. That sometimes quite extremely. But
I also think that the act of persecution is a throwing out often.
Yeah.
So you kind of, in a sense, your flavour is too strong and you get through, but that's the opposite really of what that's saying.
Although I often say I think that's another reason why because I think you can draw lots of these things in that actually one of the things with salt is particularly if it can be too strong a flavour, which means people don't want it. So you want a small amount of salt on your food. If there's a big pile in the middle, you might you might complain about the dish. So all of those kind of ideas do come into play. But what we'll do is I'll pray before we all go. I'm going to stop the recording. So I'll stop the live stream. Okay. And then let's pray for blessings on us as we go through the rest of the working week. So Father, just that this